I was about 13, and I was home alone. My dad had just gone out with some friends. He's a very busy man, so I'm always happy when he gets time off. Usually I order a pizza and watch some anime or play video games. Well, one night though, when I ordered a pizza, as it was delivered to me, the pizza man said, "Hey, I noticed this weird guy walking around, so be careful, alright?" I laughed a little bit and said, "Alright man, you take care." I gave him his tip and closed the door. Later though, I heard a knock at my door. I thought to myself, who in the hell could be knocking at this time? I looked through the cameras my dad had just installed, and I saw a man standing there with something in his hand. I got a bit worried and walked to my phone and called 911. The police arrived shortly thereafter and told the man to leave or he would be arrested. The man left, so I thought that was that. I went back to my usual home alone routine. Around midnight, though, I heard another knock and looked around again. It was that same man, back once more. This time I grabbed my dad's gun from the closet and yelled at him, "If you don't go away, I will shoot you." He began to beat on the door loudly, so I ran as quickly as I could to my room and called the cops again. They came back really quickly since they had already been out once before and arrested the grotesque man. The cops told me that he was actually a man who was out on parole for breaking and entering and had just seen my house as an opportune target. This happened 5 years ago. I'm 18 now, but it's still a scary experience to think about to this day. So I'm new to Reddit. I found this sub, and I think this story fits here. I've had a number of odd and frightening experiences in the woods since I'm such a huge outdoors guy, and pretty much outside all the time I can manage it. One of these experiences I tried posting, but it got rejected. I thought this one would sound too far-fetched, but after reading some other stories on here, I decided maybe not so much. This happened when I was much younger. I want to say I was only a freshman in high school, and probably around 2008. There used to be this road near where I lived in California, called Croak Road. It was barely a road, no one traveled on it, and it was surrounded by small patches of forests and some abandoned barns and houses. I would typically go there with my friends, just to skateboard around and hang out. This one night, I was hanging out with two of my friends, Lucas and Dorian. Someone wanted to go down the Croak Road to hang out, since it was always creepy at night. It might sound lame, but we loved exploring like a bunch of 5th graders, and we weren't really into smoking or anything else, so what was there to do? I asked my 20-year-old brother James if he could drive us down into one of the nature reserves down by the road. This specific reserve was larger than the others, and had a network of gravel paths leading through it. Basically, we were looking for unexplored territory to take a little hike in. Soon, one particular path we were traveling down had become so narrow that James's Ford Explorer could no longer pass through it. We got out and walked for a while, just chatting and having fun. We walked through the woods for about half an hour, until it had gotten relatively dark out. The sun was completely gone, at which point we turned around to head back to the car. I should mention that despite being near a lot of sub-developments, this patch of forest was huge. I'd say about 1,000 acres. It was rarely visited as well, since it was very easy to get lost in, especially at night. It was a challenge getting the car turned around, but James managed it finally, and we were off back down the road. Dorian proposed to us that we turn down a different path we had passed by earlier, since it was about another 40 minutes until our parents wanted us back. We agreed because we wanted to explore a little more. Down this path was a tiny pond Dorian wanted to check out, to take pictures of, since he hadn't gotten the opportunity to ever visit it at night. It was very slow going, since this road was even crappier than the main one we were traveling on that turned off onto Croak Road. Only minutes later we got into an argument. Dorian was convinced James had taken a wrong turn, since we should have arrived at the pond by now. James claimed that he had only been driving straight the whole time. It was dark, after all. Eventually, we came to a fork in the road that none of us were familiar with. None of us knew which way to go, so we ended up playing a little game and going left, hoping that both directions would ultimately lead back to the main path. None of us were scared or anything. In fact, we were actually excited and intrigued, driving through seemingly the middle of nowhere at night. It was at this point we rounded a small bend in the road, and the headlights fell upon a surreal sight. There were 4 figures emerging from deep in the forest and crossing the road, wearing what looked to be long cloaks with the hoods up and holding flashlights. One man at the back of the group was dragging along a large duffel bag, a human-sized duffel bag. We all froze and stopped mid-conversation. As soon as our high beams landed on the 4 figures, they all froze in place. James pulled to the left and went around them. Driving past them felt like an eternity, because we couldn't have been going over 5 miles per hour due to the shitty condition of the road. Sitting in the passenger seat, I could see them mere inches beyond my window. They were indeed wearing completely black robes, and all holding flashlights. I didn't get a very good look at the bag, but judging by the way the man was holding it, something very heavy was resting inside. None of us said a word until the road straightened out, and we were far past these guys. At this point, James just muttered, "What the hell was that?" We continued down the road in silence, until I heard Lucas begin to say, "Holy shit." He repeated himself in a louder, more panicked voice. He turned around and said, "They're fucking coming back!" I twisted around in my chair to see Lucas pointing out the back window. I could barely see anything, but about 100 yards away, we could see the beams of 4 flashlights shaking erratically. These men were without a doubt running after us. All of us screamed at James to floor it, and he sped down the crappy road. The car was bouncing and shaking uncontrollably as we flew over berms and potholes. I kept my eyes on the flashlight beams until we rounded another bend in the road and they were finally out of sight. Thankfully, the path did manage to take us back to the main road. James gunned it down the path until we popped off by Croak Road and got the hell out of there. The weirdest thing was, there couldn't have been a vehicle anywhere near those guys for 50 miles in either direction. We would have seen one if there had been. We had explored most of the area before, and there wasn't anywhere to pull off the road and park. We didn't say anything more until we were back at my place. We all talked about it for a bit. My friends went home, and James and I went to bed. I didn't know if we should call the cops or not, but James, who I'd guess would be the adult in the situation, seemed pretty reluctant, so I dropped it. I never told my parents until just before writing this. They scolded me for not telling them, and told us that we should have contacted the authorities, if only to report suspicious people in the reserve. I still wish I know how the hell they got there, where they were going, and most importantly, just what was in that bag. When I was between the ages of around 8 and 12, my family and I lived about 2 blocks away from our local library. I've always loved reading, and was even part of that reading contest where you got prizes from reading a certain amount of books over the summer. Naturally, I spent as much time there as possible. One day, I took notice to an older man that started showing up at the library. He was about his 30s with dirty blonde hair that was balding, and would wear this dirty, baggy Carhartt jacket, even though it was in the middle of summer. For about a week or so, he would be in there nearly every day that I would be there, just going through the aisles, picking up books, and putting them back right away. I never saw him read or check a single thing out. However, I did notice he would peek through the shelves and whisper to children on the other side. One day, he was in the same aisle I was, and kept inching closer as I looked for my next book. He got close enough that I could actually smell him. He smelled like stale cigarettes and oil. He leaned down as I picked up a book and said, "What you reading there, sweetheart?" My parents taught me about stranger danger young, so I ignored him and went over to the next aisle. He followed me, though, and whispered to me angrily, "Hey, I'm talking to you." I said, "No, leave me alone." As I turned to leave, though, he grabbed my arm and started dragging me towards the back of the library. I screamed, and thankfully he let me go. Everyone stared at me as I ran to the front and told the woman at the desk what had happened. She told me to hurry up and get home, and that she would call the cops right away. As I began to run out, I heard the man behind me yelling, "Hey, that's my daughter." I heard a commotion as I got on my bike and rode off. I turned to look back to see the creep come out, kiss his hand, and place it where my bike just was. As the woman from the library came out to confront him, he ran off down the street, opposite the way I had gone. After that, I never went back to that library alone. First, let me start off with some background. I've been going to the gym for about 6 years consistently, every single day, mostly in the evenings at around 8 or 9 p.m., and my workouts usually last until 10 or 11. Around summer of 2018, I switched over to LA Fitness, which is a really big health club chain. I had been going there for about 6 months, when an older man, around his 30s or early 40s, I say old because I was 18 at the time and that seemed very old to me, began to approach me nearly every single time I was at the gym. He was Hispanic, shorter, around 5'8", and I believe he told me his name, which I've now forgotten, as well as how old he really was, which I've also forgotten at this point. Keep in mind that I am an 18-year-old 5'2" female, so in the beginning I took his attentions to be friendly, and I was friendly back to him, but tried to end conversations quickly. He liked to chat for a very long time, and I just wanted to get my workouts done and leave. In the beginning, when he first started approaching me, he would tell me he thought I was very beautiful, that he would love to take me out for drinks, etc. He asked for my name and how old I was. I told him because I thought that was innocent enough. He also told me he had a young daughter with his ex, whom he described as psycho. He told me he would love for me to meet this daughter. Obviously, I brushed all of these invites off, and eventually I began to get extremely annoyed. I would dread showing up at the gym because I didn't want to be approached by him. One day, about a year of him approaching me nearly every day, regardless even of me changing my times of going, he would spend hours there every day. An older gentleman who was exercising on a bike behind me noticed him come up to me. And by this time, I had been ignoring the creepy guy every single time he approached me, for several weeks at this point. I pretended to focus extra hard on my workout and just listen to my music. He stood next to me and began speaking, calling my name, doing everything to try and get my attention, but I just kept ignoring him. After a few minutes, I guess he began feeling awkward and just silently walked away. The gentleman behind me got my attention and told me that he had seen this guy talking to me several times, even watching me work out from a distance every time I was at the gym. He told me that I should report the man and straight up tell him to leave me alone, because what he was doing was definitely harassment. I told the man thank you, and decided to just brush it off as him just being an extra creepy guy. The next time he tried to approach me, I finally told him to leave me alone. I told him that I had a boyfriend, and that I was not interested at all. After that, he actually did leave me alone. Occasionally, I would work out with one of my friends, who told me that she noticed a strange older Hispanic man watching me work out at the gym, but I brushed that off. I know, I sound really stupid, but I truly thought he was just a background person and not a threat. Flash forward, December of 2019. I was nearing the end of my workout. It was 11 p.m. when I noticed him at the gym. I didn't think that he had spotted me yet, so as soon as I saw him, I decided to cut my workout short and began walking to the front doors of the gym. I had one headphone in and one out just in case. The gym was relatively empty by that time, and I was a little nervous to walk alone to my car in the dark, even though I had parked so close to the entrance. As I was about to reach the doors, I began to hear him calling my name. "Hey, Stephanie! Stephanie!" I immediately began to panic and started walking away faster. He, I shit you not, started tapping my back and gripped my arm, still calling my name. By this point, some people in the gym had started to pay attention. I briefly turned to him and yanked my arm away. I ran out of the gym to my car, locked the doors, and left. He had never done anything like that before, so I was shaken up by it, of course. By the time I went to work out again the next day, around 8 p.m., I had talked myself out of being scared. I decided I would just keep my eyes open and be extra cautious of him if he showed up. I was working out by the dumbbell area, on the far end of the gym, where the benches are and a mirror spanning the whole wall. Machines and workout equipment were behind me, and through the mirror I could see everything going on. I saw him enter and walk to a machine a few feet behind me, so I began hurrying my workout. I finished a set of an exercise I'm doing and look up into the mirror to see what he was doing. I saw him smiling at me from his machine into the mirror. I immediately got goosebumps and began to put all of my equipment away. I avoided looking his direction or the mirror at all. When I came back to pick up my water bottle, which I had left on the bench I was working out on, I briefly noticed someone sitting on the bench next to mine. I looked into the mirror to scan my surroundings again, and right next to me is him, staring at me in the mirror. Extremely on edge and nervous by this point, I immediately left, asking one of the front desk attendants to walk me to my car. I got in my car, locked my doors, and called my boyfriend to tell him what had happened. After 10 minutes of talking in the parking lot, I noticed a big truck directly across from me turn on and turn their bright straight on in my face. I thought it was strange, so I squinted into the light to see who might be in there. It was just the outline of a smaller man. I quickly realized it must have been the same man from the gym. I booked it out of there, checking my mirrors to make sure he wasn't following me. By that time I was shaking, and I noticed the truck pulling out of the parking lot and driving right behind me. I still couldn't clearly make out who it was, but I was definitely freaking out. I drove almost all the way home, with that same truck following me the whole way. I quickly realized I couldn't literally just lead him to my house, because out of all the stupid things I had done so far, that would be a whole nother level. I pulled into a grocery store parking lot that was well lit and extremely populated, waiting to see what he would do. He kept driving past me. I waited 20 minutes in the lot before finally driving home, making sure I was not being followed. After that, you would think I would just change gyms or call the police. Well, no. 18-year-old me still denied that it was 100% him, or that anything would happen to me. The rest of that week I had no encounters with him at all, so the incident began to leave my mind. The next Tuesday, it was January 2020 now, I was at the gym once again. Around 11 p.m., I had just finished my workout and was about to leave. I hadn't really paid attention to whether the guy was there or not. I scanned the gym once before leaving, but I didn't see anything at all. I headed to my car, got in, but of course forgot to lock the doors. I sat there texting my boyfriend, asking when he would call. We were long distance at the time, so we usually called at night. All of a sudden, someone starts knocking on my window. I jumped slightly and looked out of my window. It was him. He started calling my name, and I could even see him reaching down to the door handle. Somehow in those few moments, I remembered that I hadn't locked the doors and immediately hit the lock button. The smile that formed on his face is one that I will never forget. He looked almost smug, like he knew even that wouldn't help me. He began banging on my window, telling me to unlock and open the door repeatedly. Eventually he moved to pulling on the handle. In retrospect, I realized my first instinct should have been to call the police. But in that moment I panicked and decided to call on my boyfriend. My phone instantly hooked up to my car's Bluetooth and started ringing very loudly, so loud you could even hear it on the outside. I think that's what really saved me. As soon as he heard the ringing, I assumed he believed I was calling the police. He immediately ran away and got into the car one over from mine. He pulled out. It was the same big truck that had been shining its headlights at me and had followed me almost all the way home a week before. I was shaking with fear, talking to my boyfriend and explaining what had happened. I also called my mom and told her, too. I don't know why, but I never called the police to report it, mostly because I wasn't sure they would believe me, and I didn't have any evidence at all to back me up. Since then, though, I have changed gyms, gotten a taser. I work out only during the day, and I always look over my shoulder every single time I'm somewhere alone. I still wonder what would have happened that night if I hadn't remembered that my doors were unlocked. He could have been a rapist, a kidnapper, serial killer even, sex trafficker, anything. Maybe even just a desperate man. I live in a not-so-great part of town. It isn't the worst, but you do hear gunshots sometimes and also hear about the occasional break-in. I work nights and come home at about 2 in the morning, and then I have to walk my dog. I'm a woman, so I carry a knife and a flashlight with me when I go. I haven't gotten around to getting a carrying permit yet, so I don't have a gun. Usually our walks are uneventful and I get back without any issue. This time, however, was different. I was taking our usual route when I noticed that my dog had stopped walking suddenly and started a low guttural growl. She's done this before when a cat or another dog is around, so I pulled on her leash and told her it was okay. After a couple of times of trying to get her to continue, I decided to follow her gaze to see what had her spooked. At first, it took me a second for me to see what she was barking at, but then I saw him. A hooded man stood on the corner I pass every night, hidden just slightly behind a tree. I was just under a half block away and stood there frozen, staring at this figure. He must have noticed that I had stopped walking, because he came out from behind the tree and slowly started advancing toward my direction. My dog started to growl louder and stood out in front of me. "Hey, I'm not in any trouble or anything. I'm just looking for Colfax Street." I took a step back. "I don't know where that is, sorry." "Well, do you have a phone? I really don't know where I am, and I could use the help." "No, I'm sorry, I have to go." "A pretty girl like you out at night alone without a phone? How trusting of you. You got a boyfriend? Live alone, maybe?" he asked, stepping closer. Now my dog is starting her low warning barks, and I can tell she's got him a bit nervous. "I'm not alone. I have my dog right here, and she's very protective." He shrugged his shoulders and turned to walk the way he had came. My dog relaxed, and I turned around and started power walking back to my house. Suddenly, though, I heard heavy footsteps running in my direction. I turned around and saw the man was sprinting directly at me. He took both my dog and I by surprise, but I managed to move out of his reach just in time. I pulled my knife out, and my dog was now doing those vicious barks and snarls they do whenever they're pissed off. "I will let her tear your ass up, or I'll stab you myself." The man threw his hands up and said, "Whoa, hey, remember, I said I'm no trouble." The man just stood there with his hands up, so I quickly bent down and grabbed at the hook of my dog's leash, preparing to release her. All right, I'll go," the man said. He finally turned and sprinted away from us. The next day, I went and finally applied for my carrying license. The timeline for all of this begins in spring 2019. Earliest screenshots indicate April, and continues into around November of 2019. It only occurred to me recently that this story would be appropriate for this sub. It's easily the wackiest and creepiest interpersonal situation I've ever experienced, and it took an absurdly long time just to unravel. From the beginning, I felt like a detective trying to suss out the identity of my harasser. In the end, when all the pieces rapidly fell together, my head was spinning, and I was overwhelmed with confusion, betrayal, and an ominous sense that I may have been spared from something much worse. So, let's begin. I had a friends with benefits relationship with a man named Judah, beginning in 2018. He came along during one of those doomed, let's open our relationship as a last-ditch effort not to break up type relationships. I enjoyed his presence, but didn't necessarily feel a deep connection. My relationship with Judah tapered off amicably, with our interactions becoming limited to liking each other's Tumblr posts and the occasional Snapchat. After a while of no interaction, Judah contacted me for some writing advice. I wanted to be genuinely useful, so I wrote a few paragraphs of heartfelt constructive feedback. He thanked me for my input, and after that point our interactions ceased altogether. Now, not long after I had written this out, I had begun to receive some very vicious anonymous messages on Tumblr. And the first few were insulting my appearance and my art-making ability. I shrugged it off. Random trolls are as common as gnats, and at this point I didn't really think anything of it. The messages continued rolling in, though, and they began to become more and more disturbingly specific. The harasser began to imply that they knew where I lived, and dropped even that they knew what school I went to. This wasn't information readily available on my blog, obviously. At this point, I knew I had to be receiving them from somebody that I knew in real life, or from a creep who was dedicated enough to figure out my full name from the clues on my blog. Difficult for sure, but definitely not impossible. It was around this point that I began to suspect Judah. Extremely few people from real life knew about my Tumblr URL, and he was the only person who I could guess any motive for jealous harassment since we weren't talking anymore. I didn't think he was the type of person to act like that, but crazy people can be very talented at hiding the fact that they're crazy. I immediately blocked him on all social media and assumed that I'd just be moving on with my life. Wrong. The messages became more frequent and even creepier. They began to make fun of my disabilities and threaten physical attacks. A common theme amongst the messages was about how being disabled made me useless and undesirable. Strangely, Christianity kept being brought into it, as they claimed that my illnesses were a result of God's punishment. I had started to dread whenever the new message icon appeared, so I turned off anonymous messaging. This measure did not prevent me from further harassment, though, because all it did was began the series of dedicated harassment accounts, with the first messages coming from a brand new account called Asshole Chaosbringer. The tone of the interactions began to turn noticeably more occult. The messages started to talk about how Lord Satan is displeased with me. I blocked this account, of course. From this, I became confident that it was a single person sending me all of these messages, despite the fact that they tried to sound as though they were coming from different sources. Hateful messages were, and still are, exceedingly rare for me, and there was clearly a person very dedicated to trying to freak me out. I suspected Judah even more at this point, but I didn't have any evidence, so I chose not to confront him. After the blocking of the original account, I began receiving messages almost right away from another shiny brand new account. The messages from this account truly take the cake for batshittery. I'm attaching screenshots, because although this is quite the work of creative writing, I wasn't the one who made it up. Message 1. I almost feel bad that the demons I work for have been telling me to torment you so much. You already are the way you are. Isn't that torment enough? I almost feel some mercy. But this energetic warfare isn't over yet. Tonight on this full moon, things will get crazy. Maybe I'll try to get the demons to leave you alone, although all they want is to eat your soul. You poor tormented little thing, hiding in false confidence and false power. We pity you, truly. I pray you have protection methods. Copy pasta, anyone? Message 2. I really don't want to have to bring this curse down on you, but, the demons got me, and I have to do their bidding or else I'm the one getting hurt. I hope you understand. P.S. Selenite is really great. You should use it. I'm so sorry for all of this. Really, I'm so sorry. The Abyss demands balance and justice for what you've done. I'm so very sorry. I wasn't moved by their prose, and blocked this account as well. There was one more account created to harass me, after which I assumed this person ran out of alternate email addresses. A little while later, after a period of silence from this person, I decided to turn on anonymous messaging again. To my dismay, almost immediately after I changed the setting back, hate messages started trickling back in, using the exact same language I've come to expect from my usual harasser. At one point, I even received a heartfelt apology, clearly from the same person who had been writing all of the other hateful messages. One day after, though, after I'd posted their apology, they instantly backtracked and started harassing me even worse. At the same time, I began to get anonymous messages from someone who said they noticed from my photos that we lived near each other. They said they were interested in becoming friends, but were too shy to reveal themselves. I gently prodded this person to message me from their actual account, and they eventually did. This person introduced themselves as Elm. They were a non-binary person who was new to the area and didn't know many people outside of their work. We chatted for a little bit and found some common ground. They were way more spiritual than I was, but I'm not disinterested in that kind of thing, so we talked about our individual theologies. Their spirituality set off a little red flag, though. I suspected that perhaps this could have been the person who sent the curse message, so I asked a question as a test. Do you know much about astrology? Previous messages had made extensive use of my birth chart when insulting me. They responded, just barely. Why? I breathed a little sigh of relief and marked them off as safe in my head. Since this harassment was still an issue to me at the time, I decided to tell them about it. In response, they said, Jesus, that's honestly kind of scary. I'm sorry you've got some really bitter person coming for your throat. Anyways, a few days after, I began to consider this person a friend. We weren't the most compatible, but they were having a rough time, and I had the time and resources to help them out. After a bit, we decided to meet up. My usual weed man had run dry, and they had somebody that I could buy from, so I agreed to pick them up at their place. We would go get the pod and then chill at mine. They met me at their apartment's leasing office, which they claimed was because they needed to pay rent. I picked up the weed and went back to my apartment. We ended up driving way longer than expected, due to being given a wildly incorrect address. Therefore, I was unexpectedly tired by the time we arrived back at my place. On the way up to my apartment, they tripped and fell, twisting their ankle. I offered them an ankle compress to mitigate the injury, and they took it. We smoked and chatted for a while. The interaction was normal, maybe a little bit awkward. Elm had a manic energy, which would seem to randomly flap, after which they'd snap back to their frenetic disposition. My exhaustion from the extra long drive cut our hangout short because I had to drive them home before I became too exhausted to operate the car safely. They seemed kind of disappointed. I assumed this was just because we had only hung out for a short time. I dropped them off back at home and had a generally positive regard for Elm afterwards. The anonymous messages began to dry up at this point, although I still got them, and they were very nasty. I messaged Elm occasionally. I was intending to take them to a nearby formal garden. Then, suddenly I got a message from Elm. They said we just didn't have enough in common, and that they weren't interested in being friends with me anymore. I was taken aback by this, and a little hurt. I had never experienced a friend breaking up with me like that, yet I still didn't feel suspicious of them. By absolute complete coincidence, on the same day, my best friend Monica logged into her Tumblr account for the first time in over a year. She had received hateful messages, dating all the way back to spring of 2019. They were clearly from the very same person that had been harassing me. This felt like the nail on the coffin as far as damning evidence against Judah. There was precisely one mutual friend that knew the Tumblrs of both of us, and it was only him. With that, I felt confident to proceed with the confrontation. Immediately, he claimed he knew nothing about the messages. I wasn't surprised that he'd deny it, so I pressed on. However, he mentioned something that caught my attention. He knew that his partner had sent a hateful message to me after I had written that writing advice for him. Apparently, they had gotten jealous after learning of our past relationship. I checked his latest Instagram posts, and my heart sank. Wait, is that your partner, Elm? Yeah, they are, but they insist they have nothing to do with what you're getting now. There's something fucked up here, like really fucked up. I find it really strange that they met me without ever letting on that they were involved with you. Just today, they said we can't be friends anymore. At this point, I assume it was Judah's turn for his heart to sink. He asked me some clarifying questions. I told him about the timeline of our meeting, let him know that I gave them my ankle brace. He said they never told him anything about us hanging out, and that they had said they just got the brace from work. Just then, it felt like all of the information I'd gathered in the past year was swirling around me like a whirlwind. This whole time, the blame I had assigned to the innocent Judah belonged to Elm. This person so violently hated me, without ever having met me at all, used deceit to earn my trust enough to let them into my home. He had been actively harassing me for 5 months by the time they reached out and revealed themselves. The lies continued for 3 more after that. They even lied about not being knowledgeable about astrology so as to not implicate themselves and to avoid being caught. A few days after that passed, and the hateful messages stopped suddenly and completely, exposing Elm's guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. Judah reached out to me to let me know that he and Elm had separated, and that was the last time I ever heard from either of them. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't cut our hangout short that day. Maybe I wouldn't really have had anything to worry about. Perhaps they were all bark and no bite, but they were clearly hiding some very deep troubles under that very excitable facade.